Philip Hammond will face his toughest test as Chancellor on Wednesday when he stands up to deliver his third and most important budget statement. By comparison, the 2016 autumn statement and this year's spring budget were exercises in treading water. Conservative MPs expect him to set the agenda for the rest of the government's term and deliver a vision of how Britain will prosper outside the European Union. The task is daunting. Without an overall majority, and with factions inside the party calling for his head, Hammond is in a bind. Loosening the purse strings will upset Tories who want to eliminate the deficit sometime in the next 10 years. Keeping austerity in place risks further cuts to politically sensitive public services such as the NHS, schools and the police. Hammond wants to sidestep this debate and focus on measures to improve productivity, boost the housing market, help consumers and support high-growth firms. Here we examine 5 areas he must tackle to show that the government has, at the very least, an economic strategy, even though questions will remain over the existence of funds to implement it. Austerity head teachers have warned that schools are engulfed in a funding crisis. Photograph Alamy Hammond is under pressure to alleviate the pain spending cuts have inflicted on public services and the welfare system over the past 7 years. His aim is to reduce government borrowing to below 2% of GDP by 2021 and to eliminate the deficit, the gap between state income and expenditure, by 2025. These deadlines are sufficiently far away to give him room for maneuver on Wednesday. Last week, a group representing 5,000 head teachers visited Downing Street to tell Hammond that the new national funding formula for schools in England, introduced by Education Secretary Justine Greening in September, had done little to alleviate the funding crisis engulfing schools across the country. While the new system included a £1.3 billion investment, the National Audit Office had already announced that schools would face real-term cuts of £3 billion by 2020, so they would still be £1.7 billion worse off. The budget for schools, like that for hospitals, was deemed protected during the coalition government. This was after David Cameron pledged in 2010 to increase funding for those departments at least in line with inflation, while other parts of Whitehall took real terms cuts of up to 40%. Both departments had, however, fared better under Labour. Schools had improved their results over the previous decade on the back of inflation-busting increases. Likewise, the NHS had enjoyed budget increases of 4% in real terms on average since the turn of the century, compared with 1% after 2010. The funding support of the Blair and Brown era has gone. Schools face real-term cuts between now and 2021, while the NHS is still on its growth path of 1%. Meanwhile, rising demand in both creates a sense that departments are going backwards, and stokes public anger. Labour has pledged to increase funding for schools, restore police numbers and boost NHS and local government budgets, paid for by tax rises and a bigger clampdown on tax avoidance. Hammond's tax rises will probably mimic the stealth taxes favoured by Gordon Brown. In his spring budget, Hammond increased insurance premium tax, as a painless surcharge on the industry. Insurers have warned against a repeat, as have whiskey makers after an increase in duty in spring. Torsten Bell, chief executive of the Resolution Foundation think tank, says Hammond could freeze income tax thresholds after they reach the levels pledged in the Tory manifesto in 202,122, a tax-free allowance of £12,000 and a 40p rate threshold of £50,000. A freeze after 202,122 would free up £8.6 billion, which he could choose to bank now and promise as extra spending for schools and hospitals. Public sector pay hospitals say the pay cap is making it almost impossible to fill ward vacancies. Photograph Peter Bernthal. Back in the summer, a report showed that teachers were £3 an hour worse off in real terms and police officers by £2 an hour over the past decade, while the wages of nurses had stagnated. A report by the Institute for Fiscal Studies (IFS) found average public sector earnings had fallen by 4% in real terms since 200,910, and said continuing pay restraint would take wages to historically low levels compared with the private sector. With a 1% pay cap in place, schools and hospitals across the UK are finding it difficult to fill teaching and nursing posts. However, increasing public sector pay across the board in line with either prices or private sector earnings would be expensive, adding £6 billion a year by 201,920 to the cost of employing 5.1 million public sector workers. Hammond's message is expected to be sympathetic, as much to address the gender pay gap across the public sector as the average pay in Whitehall, local government and frontline services. He has already given the police and prison officers a 1% rise plus a 1% bonus for 201,718, but there will be little extra in the kitty with teachers already set to remain on 1%. Housing. The housing minister says 300,000 new homes a year are needed. Photograph. Gareth Fuller. Borrow to build is Sajid Javid's favorite slogan. The Secretary of State responsible for housing says up to 300,000 additional homes must be built in England each year, up from around 150,000 in 2015 and a little more than 220,000 over the past year. Last month Javid said the aim was for a big increase in all types of home, including social housing, so-called build-to-rent properties and shared equity homes, where a buyer's mortgage only covers part of the market value of the property. We are looking at new investments, and there will be announcements. I am sure the budget will be covering housing, he said. The Bank of England's Help to Buy scheme is infamous for lining the pockets of developers rather than spurring house building, so the Chancellor will be looking at fresh ideas. One is for local authorities to be able to borrow funds and to be given greater freedom to develop local housing schemes. Last year Hammond promised £7.2 billion to support the construction of new homes. The local government association says planners are giving the go-ahead to 90% of applications made, but with plenty of NIMBYs lobbying against new schemes, only greater powers for local politicians will break the logjam and allow the money to be spent. Transport and investment budgets always include road widening schemes. Photograph. Alamy. One section of every post-2010 budget speech is always dedicated to a list of road widening schemes, dual carriageway extensions and motorway repairs. Sometimes the introduction of a potholes hotline adds some levity to the Chancellor's list of planned capital projects. The same is expected this time, though MPs will be disappointed if they hear nothing about faster rail links between northern cities as part of efforts to increase productivity. Hammond said last year if the UK raised its productivity by 1 percentage point every year, within a decade it would add £240 billion to the size of the economy, £9,000 for every household in Britain. He has already handed out most of his investment funds to the Transport Department, which probably couldn't handle any more cash without throwing it wasty at consultants. The capacity of the railway system for change is also pushing at the margins of what is possible, especially now that private contractors including Carillion, which is working on the HS2 line from London to Birmingham, are in financial trouble. A £23 billion National Productivity Investment Fund was launched last December with £2.6 billion to improve transport networks. Digital networks are also on Hammond's radar, and he will look to shift the debate from trains to broadband, especially for enhancing the connectivity of the Northern Powerhouse. Students and young people. A student march in London this month. A review of fees and loans is underway. Photograph. March in Wajantix. Pressure to match Labour's pledge to cut university fees to zero has eased. The pledge, worth between £8 billion and £12 billion a year to students, might have won Labour a large rise in under 25 votes, but Tories are well aware that without matching Labour's tax rises, it will send the deficit soaring. Theresa May has already made an expensive commitment to raise the threshold at which students begin repaying their loan, from £21,000 to £25,000. She told the Tory conference that tuition fees would also be frozen at the current £9,250 until 2019, rather than increased with inflation by £250. A review of student finance is underway, with ideas to reform the fees structure, possibly aligning fees more closely to the salaries graduates of a certain course can later command. But Hammond is expected to say that his plan to increase housing stock is the best way to help young people, possibly allied to an income tax age allowance for under-30s. The allowance could taper away as income rises. David Kilshive, accountant, said an alternative would be to reduce national insurance for under-30s. One key theme is intergenerational fairness. Typically chancellors used tax breaks to help the elderly, but this time the break may tilt towards the next generation. Follow Guardian Business on Twitter @BusinessDesk, or sign up to the Daily Business Today email here.